Welcome to Classic Game Room, where today I'm bringing you another fun competitive review, and this one is interesting because these two game systems were rivals when they were new, but today they're totally different. So, which game system is better to collect for? The Sony PlayStation or the Sega Saturn? Two of my favorite game consoles. From the mid-90s, I first played Sega Saturn. A friend of mine had one down the hall, and we'd spend hours playing Virtua Fighter 2 in Daytona, USA. Great times. And then eventually I bought a PlayStation after witnessing Final Fantasy VII at a friend's dorm, and played that for, well, months on end. And then got into Tekken 2 and Bushido Blade and countless other PlayStation games. So I didn't get a Saturn until much later in life. In fact, you can see the 2008 video where I buy a Sega Saturn for the first time. Now I have about 4 of them. And I absolutely love collecting for the Saturn. And I also like collecting for the PlayStation, but they're different animals, completely different animals these days. So it's hard to say which game system is a better game system. I think the PlayStation obviously has far more games. There was far more support for the PlayStation. And in some respects, it did 3D better than the Sega Saturn. But the Saturn was better at 2D games, and especially Japanese spaceship shooters, one of my favorite genres. So, collecting for the Saturn or the PlayStation these days, PlayStation, you can just get yourself a PlayStation 3. That's actually a great way to play some PS1 games, PlayStation 1 games. A PlayStation 2 will also do the job, or you can pick up a PS1 or an old-fashioned PlayStation. I don't have one of those anymore, but I do have the smaller PS1, which is actually a nice little game system, using this in the Tekken 2 review. The Sega Saturn game system itself is actually not all that expensive if you're just buying a standard Sega Saturn. It'll cost you more than a PlayStation, an original PlayStation, but they're not cost prohibitive. It's not like buying a Neo Geo or something. It's not like buying an R-Zone. You see, you just don't want to buy an R-Zone. You actually want a Sega Saturn. The problem is the games. Because in my opinion, the games that you really want to play on the Saturn are the expensive ones. They're the Japanese games for the most part. They're the games that you'll have to import, and the Sega Saturn will play import games fairly easily. With one of those action replay cards. You can watch my review of that. And of course, I've reviewed a whole bunch of Sega Saturn stuff over the years. I think that it's a more compelling library when looking at the Sega Saturn's game library. You've got games like Donpachi and Dodonpachi. You've got Virtuon. You've got Daytona USA. You've got all the Virtua Fighter games. You've got some amazing Street Fighter games. Capcom gave a lot of support to the Saturn, so you've got X-Men Children of the Atom, Marvel Superheroes. There's a bunch of fighting games on the Saturn that are really good. The Saturn was great at 2D games, like the Capcom fighting games and spaceship shooters. But the PlayStation has a much, much larger library filled with a more eclectic variety of games. And it's kind of like the Sega Genesis game catalog in a way, where you've got these incredible games, but also a lot of games which are terrible, but still kind of fun and likable. You've got everything from your Gran Turismo games. You've got Front Mission 3, Dino Crisis. You had that whole era with Fear Effect, Final Fantasy 7, Final Fantasy Tactics was one of my favorites, Bushido Blade. The 3D games weren't that good looking, but some of them are really good, like Bushido Blade, and the Tekken games are excellent. But then you've got a lot of just weird-ass, just not so good action games. But most of the PlayStation stuff is also pretty cheap. So if you're starting to collect for the PlayStation 1 or the Saturn these days, the PlayStation 1 is more approachable. It's more affordable. Sure, some of these games will cost you a couple bucks, maybe an original Final Fantasy VII, but you can also download a lot of these from the PlayStation Network. And don't forget that if you're trying to get into PS1 games, you can also just use a PlayStation 2 or 3. So Sega Saturn's a little trickier. You'll have to import a lot of them depending on where you live in the world, especially for the spaceship shooters and some of the fighting games, but you may find that they're also worth it. There's just nothing else quite like the Sega Saturn, except maybe the Dreamcast, but in some respects, I think the Saturn is even cooler because it really just didn't get a lot of love, yet it deserved it. So, there you go. Which is the best game system? Well, they're both good. It depends on what you're trying to play and what your budget is. So, hopefully that's somewhat helpful and maybe mildly entertaining. So, there you go. Sega Saturn and PlayStation. Ideally, you have them both because that opens up a huge world of amazing games and also a lot of really terrible ones too. Thanks for watching. See you soon. Get your CGR shirts and glassware at ClassicGameRoom.com. Classic Game Room is brought to you by Magnum Skywolf. CGR is supported by fans on Patreon. Thank you.